All right, good evening. I should say muchas, something like that. I'm wearing this because I had one and only trip to Cuba with local lawyer Marilyn Peterson, who's bilingual and still working on behalf of Cuban immigrants that come to Gainesville. And we went with an Episcopal church group, to three different places, including Havana. And of course, every tourist has to buy one of these shirts and one of these hats to cover up the bald head. But and also just to explain, I'll be wearing this most of the evening because my son came down for the Tennessee game and brought me a gift, his head cold. It's not COVID. So I particularly welcome you here to the Matheson because there's so much to see. The room you're in is currently featuring the Great Southern Music Hall, which was in vogue in the 1970s after I left school. That shows how old I am. In 1973, 74, 75, Jeffrey Meldon and his friends were running an 800-seat venue for acts from all over the country who were very famous. And the only reason they stopped in Gainesville is they were on their way to South Florida for a major weekend gig. We also, in the next room, and it's very appropriate, for the program tonight, we have the exhibit We Are Here, which features all of the different language groups that are in Gainesville, Alachua County now that need to be recognized and need public services. And it's, in other words, inclusivity. Because at the Matheson, we strongly believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm sorry if that's a little bit political, but that's what we strongly feel. So I urge you, when you have a chance to walk around, to take advantage of the exhibits. And if you're inspired by the program that you hear tonight, sign up to be a member of the Matheson. What we have tonight for you is two friends who have been friends for a long time, who love each other, and one who has immigrated from Cuba, uh, Mario Cartaya, who is now my temporary neighbor while he's building a house in Oakmont. And he had he's a wonderful story, some of which I've already heard. I won't, spill the beans, but Mario is a well-known, renowned South Florida architect. He made quite a career in South Florida designing public buildings like the Justice Center, the airport terminal, things of that sort. And he's being honored at the end of the month in Miami, September 29th, for his work as an architect, one of 12 uh, uh, most influential architects. And in his post-retirement life, like I'm a retired attorney, haven't been practicing law for quite a while, he is writing books, and we're going to hear about one of them tonight. And also is another retired lawyer, David Powell. He's from FSU. I'm from UF. But he practiced law for 30 years throughout the state of Florida. And in his kind of retirement life, began interviewing a lot of Cuban immigrants about their experiences. And they both wrote books. And what they're going to do tonight is interview each other, talk to each other in a conversation, and we're going to hear some great stories. I have no doubt about it. And just a technical thing, when we get to the Q&A portion, we're going to bring up another mic because this is all on Zoom. When we're going to record it on Zoom, should be recorded now. In a couple of days, it'll be uploaded to our YouTube website. And so it'll be there for others to see for a long time. So it's important that everybody who speaks into a microphone. Otherwise, you won't be heard. And if you don't, one of these gentlemen will have to repeat the question, so that we get it all understood and makes some sense. And so also I want to say that the Matheson is a nonprofit. It doesn't depend on government or a state or corporation or anything like that. We're funded by grants. We are funded by contributions and donations and memberships and all of that. And this program is sponsored in part by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the City of Gainesville, the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. So yeah, we get grants, and that's very important. But you know what? Those grants pay for programs, but they don't pay for the light bill. We have 4 buildings in this complex. This is just one of them, the old American Legion Hall. We have the 1857 Sarah Matheson House next door, which you can see by appointment. And we're a champion for the Sweetwater Park Greenway, which is part of our grounds. And if it takes place, it'll run right past us. The Sweetwater branch is on this side, and hopefully connect the duck pond and the rest of the city with a bike loop, and we get a crosswalk across East University and make it safe. And we also have across the street a museum, library, and archives in the old melting pot building. That's where most of our collections are. And it's climate controlled and all of that. So our mission is to preserve and interpret Alachua County history. And back in the day, Alachua County extended all the way to the Florida state line. So we have quite a bit here to enjoy, and it's great for researchers. And it's my great honor to introduce my friend Mario Cartaya and David Powell.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I've been looking forward to this evening for a number of reasons, but let me first make very clear, whenever I'm in Gainesville, somebody always brings up the fact that I went to law school at that other law school a couple of 100 miles to the north. And the only thing I'll say in my defense is I sent my daughter and my money to the University of Florida. So happy to be back in Gainesville. One of the reasons I've been looking forward to this is because Mario and I have had such a great collaboration since we first became friends back in 2017 when I was doing interviews for my book, and our paths continue to cross. And so I'm just so pleased that this worked out for us to do this together. The last thing I want to say by way of introduction is my publisher is the University of Florida Press. They're here in Gainesville, and I'm so pleased that the director, Romy Gutierrez, is here with us tonight. Romy, thank you for coming. Thanks for everything you and everyone at the press have done for me and my book. You did a great job.
Well, with me it's a very similar story, except I chose my college carefully. I am a Gator, and I went to school here. I'm a double graduate from UF, and now I'm a full-time citizen of Gainesville once more. And I couldn't wait to be here and be back in the city that I've always loved so much. I've been traveling a lot over my life, and I always say the same thing about my time in Gainesville. And what I always say is I came to the University of Florida in 1971 as a young Cuban kid wanting to prove I belong. I graduated 5 years later as an American architect. That's how much Gainesville meant to me, how much it changed me, and what it would set the roots for the rest of my life. So to come here is to come to really the city of my best memories in my life. So it's good to be here, good at the Matheson, good to be with you, good folks, and good to be with you, Dave. We made a great friendship, and heck, here we are all these years later, and thank you for making this happen. So I do have some questions, if you'll allow me to get started. The first one is, what gave you the inspiration to write this book?
Well, there's two answers to that question. I'm a lawyer by training, so you would expect that, right? The idea came to me when my wife and I were traveling in Europe in 2011, and we were having dinner with some friends, and we were getting ready to go to Spain, and the friends had talked to a friend of theirs who knew Spain. And so I asked the question, well, how does your friend know Spain? And the answer was his family left Cuba after Castro took over in 1959. They spent a lot of time in Europe, in Spain, before they came to Florida. And my response at the dinner table was, isn't it amazing how many people we know who have that story? They left Cuba when Castro took over. They came to the States, and now they're part of our country. Their stories are always great stories, and somebody could do a really good book by interviewing a bunch of them and doing an oral history like Studs Terkel used to do. Now, where that idea came from before it popped out of my mouth at the dinner table that night, I have no idea. I have no conscious recollection of it, none at all. But what happened next was my wife turned to me and said, David, you should write that book. And so over time, I began to work on it and did so. The second answer to the question is I was drawn to the story. It's a great story because the stories that all these people tell you, like Mario and so many others who came during that period, they are stories about people who are caught up in a conflict between powerful historical forces over which they have no control. Those are always great stories because they help us understand the ability of we humans to contend with things that seem so much bigger than we are. But there's more to the story than that because it's a story about America at its best. Not perfect by any means, but as the land of refuge and opportunity that it's always been for oppressed people from around the world. And then the third facet of the story that really drew me to it was that it shows how refugees will strengthen our country if we let them. So for all those reasons, it seemed to me to be a story that was important to be told and to be remembered. And the research that we did showed that there wasn't a book quite like mine, an oral history book covering this period of the beginning of the Cuban diaspora. And so that's how I got into it, and that's why I got into it. And have to say, it's been one of the most satisfying professional experiences of my life. So now it's my turn. One of the things that you'll learn about Mario when you read his book or mine, because Mario is in my book. Mario is in my book, frankly, more than anyone else that I interviewed. Uh, and, um, and there were a number of technical reasons for that, but we had a great conversation. And one of the things in his book, and that he discusses in my book as well, was his return trip to Cuba in 2016. He went back for the first time. You wanted to test the accuracy of your memories, and so one of the things that you did was you went to all the houses that your family had lived in when you were there and before they left. Please tell us about what happened when you went to visit your family home on Cervantes Street. How did you find the house? Who was living there? And what did you discover when you went inside?
Maybe a little preamble to what I found there is one of the reasons why I went back 56 years after coming here was that I'm going through a wonderful time in my life where my history as an architect was read in the House of Representatives in Washington, and then later an American flag flown to honor me as an architect over the Capitol. And even though it was the most beautiful time of my life, there was something missing. And I realized I could not remember how I got from there to here because I could not remember the first 8 years of my life. Something had happened. Now we know, upon returning, that my subconscious had bottled all those memories in a place I couldn't access it to protect me from exactly what I needed to remember in order that I could go through my metamorphosis in 1960 when there were few Hispanics in Miami, go into a metamorphosis into a little American boy as quickly as possible, not because of any major psychological reason other than I wanted to have friends. I wanted to play baseball. I wanted to learn the game of football. I wanted to know why they ate dogs. Was his hot dog. But something incredible happened on the second house that I lived in Cuba. I had the addresses thanks to my mom, who was still alive, but no memories. So I ended up going to the second house, hoping that the stimulus from returning to the homes, the park, the school that I went to, that stimulus would remind me of my past. That second house was special. If you don't mind, could I read just a short passage from that trip? It says, "The night that changed my life." And it goes like this. I reached the top of my former home's modern stairway, sat on the floor behind the second floor balcony railing balustrades, and stared at the living room below, where Gilberto was the man who now owned the house, and my friends, the two friends that went with me, were still busy talking and drinking cold soda. I remember how 57 years ago my parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts gathered in the same living room now below me amid great sorrow and confusion. My father, whose whereabouts during the previous 24 hours had been unknown, was finally back home after being detained and raped by Che Guevara, uh, that his future was coming to the end in Cuba because of his refusal to give the military government his books with all of the property locations of his American clients in Cuba. There was a sense of heightened concern on the faces of my loved ones as they sat grim and solemn, waiting for my father to speak that night. Everyone feared that going forward, he could disappear at any time. In an effort to shield my brother and me from the sad events about to unfold in the living room, my father sent us upstairs to bed early. My brother promptly complied. I did not. This afternoon, I found myself once again sitting behind the same second floor balcony, railing balustrades from where I once peeked at the sad events unfolding below me that night, long ago. I now remembered watching my father walk towards the center of the living room and, with his voice cracking from emotion, ask my extended family for permission to leave Cuba with my mother, brother, and me towards an uncertain life of exile in the United States. Everyone in the living room that night groaned and started to cry at this horrible news. Alone, confused, in the balcony above them, I wept as well. After all the sobbing finally stopped, my grandfather walked up to my father, put an arm around his broad shoulders, and calmly said, "Ignacio," that was my father's name, "you cannot be a husband to my daughter and a father to my grandchildren if you are dead. Travel to America with your family and return to us when it's safe again. Our lives would never be the same again." And I'm back at that spot where that happened. And it all came back so vividly. And for a moment, my memories became so clear that I could see myself as an 8-year-old sitting next to me. And I wondered, this poor little boy, look at his eyes. Look at how innocent he is. He doesn't know what awaits him. I wanted to protect him. But then I realized I don't need to protect him because that's me. And then I realized the most important lesson of my trip, which is he, that person inside me, was the siren song that brought me back. He was the voice that said, "You have to go up and sit in that balcony because I want to be released from the subconscious and bring you all the memories that you wanted to." And then all the memories began coming back. Once I saw myself, all the memories began coming back, almost like a Technicolor movie. It's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful moments. And then I realized that we were but one reflection in the mirror. We were one, my one story, and my reuniting with my 8-year-old self. That's what I wanted to do. That's what my subconscious wanted me to do in order to now understand who I was rather than who I became.
Thank you. Okay, your turn.
My turn. Okay. So we've talked about this. How did you come up with that title?
He's like a good lawyer. He knows the answer to the question before he asks it.
Well, once you're married, don't you learn that? Isn't that part of the whole process? Careful what you ask.
Yeah, I said a moment ago what a wonderful experience I had dealing with everyone at the University of Florida Press. And they absolutely delivered on everything they promised me from the very first meeting when we began talking about whether I would sign a contract with them and what the book would be. And they promised that every step of the way, once they had the book, they would include me in the decision making process. Which is not to say I would get my way, but that I would have a voice and that I would be consulted. There were only two instances in the years that we worked together that we disagreed on anything. One was the title of the book, and one was the cover of the book. Two pretty important ingredients. I had learned when I was in graduate school in journalism, one of the things a writer ought to do is to develop a mental picture of the finished product that you're writing. What is it going to look like? What's it going to say? How are you going to put it together? Develop an image in your mind's eye of what it is you're going to produce. And so throughout the years I worked on the book, I had mental images of what I thought the book would look like. It evolved over time. I went through a whole bunch of working titles. All of them, the first one was 90 Miles from Home. And I like that title because the first chapter in my book is called Home, and it's memories that my narrators have of growing up in Cuba and what Cuba was like before the revolution in 1959. And the last chapter is called Home, which is about their lives in the United States and their reflections on what it means to be an American. And I like the ambiguity of 90 miles from home because you could read home as referring to either place. The 90 miles would stay the same, but the home would be different depending upon the perspective. Well, it turned out somebody had used that title for a book 30 years ago. And while you cannot copyright the title of a book, I decided to look for other ideas. And so I focused on the 90 miles. And when I turned the book in, the working title was 90 Miles Away, which kind of has that same ambiguity about it. So I turned it in and the manuscript, and they had a meeting like the next week. And my editor, who I just loved to death, called me and said, well, we've decided your title's not good enough. You need a better title. And I was just crushed. I said, okay, what are you suggesting? And she said, well, it doesn't really capture the breadth of the experience that your narrators are describing in the book. So we think, a better title would be 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away. And I had used the word lifetime in some early drafts of the book. In fact, I think in the draft that they got. But they said 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away, we think, would do a much better job of telling what the book's about. And so I said, okay, well, I'll think about it. So my wife and I talked about it. The next morning, we looked at each other and we agreed their title was better than mine. And we had the same experience on the cover image, which I won't get into, but I have to say that the collaboration was particularly meaningful to me because the people I was collaborating with were in every way imaginable making the book better than I could have made it on my own. And the title is just one very obvious illustration of that.
I love the title of your book because it kind of touched me when I learned what you were going to call it. It's only 90 miles, folks. It's just over the horizon, really. But yet, for us who left and never went back, it took me 56 years to travel 90 miles. Well, that's a lifetime away for most of us who, even though the short distance is so great because of the differences between us, right? That keep us from wanting to dare to go back. It's so sad because so many lives have been broken. So many lives have been torn apart. Now, for every Cuban who comes here who has immigrated, there's a Cuban back home that lost them and will never see him again in most cases. And so your title really resonated with me, and thank you for that title.
Thank you. When I was beginning to formulate the plan for the book, my initial plan included going to Cuba, and at that point I had never been to Cuba. I actually got to Cuba after the book came out, and trying to find relatives of people who had left the island at the beginning of the diaspora, had come to the States. I wanted to see if it was possible to get both sides of that story. I ultimately chose not to do so for a number of reasons. One, of course, was the difficulty of getting permission from the Cuban government to go do anything other than some sort of scholarly work. And even then, it's quite of a challenge. So I didn't actually follow through on that, but I always looked at it as I'm getting the perspective from the people who left, certainly not the people who stayed behind. And I think frankly there's a story there too. You went to Cuba in 2016. You thought you didn't have any relatives still there. Tell us about your trip to Hershey. What was Hershey? What is it today? And what did you find there?
Hershey is the place where the magnate Milton Hershey used to grow the sugar for his famous chocolates in Pennsylvania. And my mother's side of the family grew up in a town not far from Hershey, and eventually they moved to Hershey when my grandfather became the railroad station director. And my mother lived the first 9 years of her life in Hershey. My mother now, at the time, 93 years old, elderly, frail, in a wheelchair. I wanted to bring back something for her to make her life a little more joyful. So I was going to find the home where she grew up in the 1930s. We get to Hershey's. There's no sugar anymore. Nothing. Zero. There's nobody really around. There's a few people here and there, but nobody works in the town of Hershey. They have a pretty communal existence where they grow food in their backyards and they trade. I grow this food, you grow that food, we trade, and we're okay. They have that kind of a life. And I'm driving in the car with my two buddies who wanted to go to Varadero Beach, to the beautiful beaches of Varadero, and see the girls in bikini and everything. And meanwhile, I'm in this town with nobody, right? And my driver, Miguel, who you were reading the book, was telling me, let's just not give up. We're not going to give up, Miguel. We're going to keep looking. Meanwhile, my two buddies are, come on, let's go, guys. Let's go to the beach. Huh? We're not going to go to the beach yet. I didn't come here to give up. So I asked my dad to drive really slow through the streets of Hershey to see if I could find a woman in her 90s or a man in her 90s who could remember it was the Mateo family lived in the 1930s. We're talking a long time ago. And my friends call me every name in the book. So I'll read you a very short little passage. Jose and George thought I was at best overly optimistic, at worst just downright crazy. Several times I almost gave up my search. I'm glad I didn't. As planned, my Dell drove agonizingly slow through the streets of Hershey while I scanned the windows of every home we passed, hoping for a most improbable moment. A few minutes later, I caught a glimpse of a slim and elderly woman stooped over in an old chair, looking down at the floor of her partially screened front porch. I asked my dog to stop the car, took a deep breath of hope, left the vehicle, and slowly went towards her while flashing my friendliest, I am not a dear stranger, smile. Good morning, I said. Well, good morning, she responded. May I help you? I'm looking for the home where the Marcos Mateo family lived during the 20s and the 30s, I explained. Why on earth would you want to know where Marcos Mateo lived in that house so old by now? The elder later asked with an intrigued look on her time-worn face. Because I'm his grandson, I continued. The lovely woman straightened herself in her wheelchair, thought for a moment, smiled broadly at me, and said, Dear God, could you possibly be Mayito? Mayito means little Mario. I gulped, a cold chill ran through my spine, and I said, Yes, I am. I, I am Mario Cartaya Mateo. My name is Armenian Mateo, she said. I am from Mateo too. I am your bride. Unbelievable. Now you have to also realize that in the first 10 years since I arrived in 1960, everyone was dead in my family. There, at the time, the only way to really communicate was through phone calls at 2 in the morning that many times were never made, or telegraphs. Once in a while, you may get a letter if you were fortunate, but there was very little communication, and I thought I had nobody left. And here, serendipity, uh, miracle happens.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. I love that story.
So, your turn. Combining authors, I love this. Um, Dave, you spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people, and most of those guys I knew, they were friends of mine from going way back. Did you find any similar threads, storylines, qualities, or perhaps even habits from those people you interviewed? What was the common thread?
I interviewed 54 people for this book and had all their conversations transcribed and then edited the transcripts and then took pieces of the transcripts from various interviews and used them to essentially explain the larger experience that the Cubans who came over between 1959 and 1973 in the first two waves of the Cuban diaspora that they experienced. I came through my interviews and through the archival research I did in Miami, here in Texas, to look at the Cuban diaspora as a series of episodes. I mean, I had a pretty superficial understanding of it at the outset. They got on a plane in Havana, they got off the plane in Miami, they set up their house, and then they went on about the business of living. Well, I mean, that's as misleading as it could possibly be, and yet I was kind of working from that assumption as I was digging deeper and deeper into it. And I came to the conclusion that there are so many different episodes in the Cuban diaspora. The individual stories are different in many respects. There are commonalities, and I will get to that. But but people came the first wave, the second wave. They came from Havana. They came from somewhere else on the island. They came to Miami. They went to somewhere else in the States after they got here. Or they went to some third country first, like Spain or Mexico. And then after a while, they came here. They came as part of a family. They came as unaccompanied minor children through Operation Pedro Pan and through other programs that were set up at the time. And so it's the sum total of those episodes in my mind that really reflects what the experience was that the Cuban exiles had in the first two waves in that 15-year period. Now that said, there were obvious commonalities. For almost everyone who left Cuba during that period, they had to leave with the clothes on their back, maybe a little pocket money, maybe a small suitcase with a couple of changes of clothes if they were lucky, and that was it. They had to leave everything behind, which is something that it's hard for the rest of us, I think, to probably comprehend. Consequently, when they arrived here, they had nothing. They were impoverished by and large, the vast majority of them. Many of them, particularly in the first wave, were educated. Doesn't mean they weren't educated. It just means by having to leave everything behind, they didn't have much when they got here. A great many of them benefited from the refugee assistance program that President Kennedy set up in 1961. It's one of the first things he did. It was the most generous assistance program for newcomers to this country that has ever been put in place. It had income maintenance for those who met need standards. It had medical care and dental care for those who met need standards. There were subsidies for the Dade County schools because there was such a large influx of Cuban children into those schools. There were professional programs set up at universities to help Cuban professionals train up to take licensing exams in the United States. And I think one of the most interesting and most important ingredients in that refugee assistance program was the Cuban loan. The Cuban loan. The first interview I had was with a former law partner who had gone to school here. He'd gone on an athletic scholarship, and I said, well, how did your brothers go to college? Because his brothers went to school here as well. And he said, well, they had a Cuban loan. I said, well, what's a Cuban loan? Some kind of loan you could get if you were a Cuban, but that's all he knew. And I couldn't find anybody who really knew much about it. But I ultimately found in the archival work I did the story of the Cuban loans. And the Cuban loans were loans that the United States government, the American taxpayers, made to Cuban nationals who met need standards so they could go to college in the United States. And here's one of them.
Yes.
These, and we've got more in the audience. These loans were incredibly important for creating a whole group of leaders in the Cuban exile community who became leaders in business and government and the arts in the following years. So that was a common experience, the assistance that they got from the government in terms of dealing with the needs that they had. And I think the other commonality I will mention is just the sheer drive to succeed that so many of them brought with them. Some of the younger ones talked about how their parents would tell them, you are Cuban, you are from an important country, a country that has made great progress, and you can do anything that these American kids can do. A number of people I talked to told me that was the message they got from their parents. So I think there are a lot of obvious differences in terms of the personal experiences people had, but in terms of, extremely important things like need and a drive to succeed, I think there are a great many commonalities among all the people I interviewed.
I had a wonderful conversation last week. Um, Next week, I'm being honored as one of the most influential architects, Cuban American architects in the United States. And my work is going to be displayed in the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora in downtown Miami. And I met with some of the other people. There's 12 of us that they selected from across the United States. And we talked about that. And one of the things that we all agreed upon, because we're all from the same period, they're all about my age. We all went to school. 3 of them came to school here in the UF with me. We knew each other when I was in school. And one thing that we agreed upon is we all wanted to rebuild the name. Our name meant something in Cuba. You know, our families, our family names. And here we are in a new country where we have to remake ourselves. And we have that chip on our shoulder that you have to be not just good, but you need to be the best. Why? Because you have to remake the name in one generation. You don't have time. It's time to make a commitment, make the name, and then stay and continue to bear the names of your work. And we all said different versions of the same thing, and we all ended up hugging each other because it reminded us of who we were, what we wanted to accomplish, but it would have never happened, David, without the Cuban loan. And it was a loan. I paid it back with interest. We all did. But wow, what a difference it made in my life.
Well, I think we're at to the point where we're going to take questions from the audience because we can tell that some of you have either questions you want to ask or stories you want to tell. So with that, shall I give you this microphone to use with the audience, and then Mario and I will share. You'll take that
You
one.
want this?
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
All right. So anybody who has a question or something you'd like to share, if you could come up and speak into this microphone, just so that we have a record of what the conversation was. But we would love to hear from you. And for the people online, if you have a question, you can also put it into the chat.
There we go.
I'll read first. Thank you.
My name is Sylvia Haller. I am a Peter Pan girl. I came to this country in 1961 without my parents, who are Holocaust survivors. So it must have been very difficult for them to send my sister and I to this country when they had survived the Holocaust in Europe. So I was telling them that to me, I came to the United States as a 12-year-old, and to me it was an adventure. And I think it goes with what you said. I try to forget those memories, to remake myself and become an American. And as someone who had red hair and lots of freckles, as long as I didn't speak, they did not know I was Cuban.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I talked to a number of Pedro Pans in the course of the research on my book, and they had many different experiences. And for some, it was traumatic, for others, less so. But I always thought it was actually one of the most interesting episodes that took place during the beginning of the diaspora. Thanks for sharing your story.
Sorry, this is probably cheating because I'm married to him. I wanted to ask Mario a question, following up on your Peter Pan story. One of the things that when David was writing the book that I found interesting was how many instances there were of Jewish families who helped the Cubans. And when we thought about it, it was like, well, it wasn't that long ago. So I just was curious whether you had that experience as well.
About having Jewish friends from Cuba? Yeah.
I know a number of the people who received help, job assistance and whatnot. Among David's narrators, a number of them had gotten that from Jewish families.
That's right.
So I was just curious your experience, Mario.
A lot of people don't really understand what Cuba is. Uh, People seem to think that all Cubans are the same, that all Cubans look alike, that all Cubans sound alike, that we all listen to the same music. Well, we all do drink rum, right? So that is that is a com- huh? Look at that. My wife back there will tell you that. Um, but Cuba is a lot like America. They are Jewish American. Here, there's Jewish Cuban. There was Black Americans here. There's Black Cubans there. There's many slaves that went from here to Cuba, trying to escape slavery during that time. There's Chinese Cubans all over the place. You know, there's red-headed Cuban friends of mine that are Russian who went there during the Russian Revolution trying to. There's Hungarians, Cubans that I've met that fought in the 1950s during that uprising. In many ways, Cuba is about as um, um, diverse as the United States. Not all Cubans are the same. My mother was blonde. My uncle was blonde because their side of the family is from northern Spain. They're all 6'4", 6'5", everybody, you know. I talk about it in the book. Uh, it's diverse. We're all different. And we all have different needs and we all have different stories and we all have different tastes. So yes, I have a lot of friends that are from all over the world, but here I have friends like Diana Wasserman, who became the first mayor in Broward County, who was Jewish, and she went to college, just like you're saying, with a Jewish assistance that he got from Jewish families here. It's incredible to see how beautiful the American people have historically been towards helping the Cubans relocate and get just a solid footwork, and then just let them go, let them grow, and let them do, and let them succeed.
Thanks for the question and for bringing up that point, Vicky, because that really was one of the most interesting discoveries that I made in the course of the interviews. And the literature that I read, and I read a lot of it, I never really saw anything in which there was discussion about how Jewish people in this country befriended the Cuban refugees. And yet, in the very first interview I had, that was one of the points that was made to me by my first interviewer. And the second interview and subsequent interviews, it was amazing to me how many people talked about just individual instances that they and their families had of being befriended by Jews in this country. And the first person I interviewed said, you know, when you think about it, the 1960s was not that far from the 1940s. And when they saw us coming, there was something that they could relate to. And that story played itself out over and over and over in my interviews and is reflected in the book. So I appreciate your bringing that up. That's a point that we frequently don't get to in these conversations, and I think it's actually an important part of the story.
So I'm going to share a question from our online audience. This is from somebody named Erica. She says, my grandfather worked in the Hershey sugar mill. It was wonderful hearing your stories about that town. Do you have pictures of Hershey you can share?
I do have pictures in the book, of course, but one of the um, similarly incredible things that happened, other than meeting a great aunt I never knew I had, was after I was done. I got pictures of the whole town that I took. I got pictures of the family that I never knew I had, me and them enjoying a family Sunday afternoon together. But on the way out with my Dell, I thought, okay, he had already taken my friends to Varadero because they didn't want to hang out with me. And so they all went to Varadero to look at the girls in bikini, and I stayed behind with this family I never knew I had. And we all had lunch together. Now, my Dell comes back from Varadero to Hershey, picks me up, and we're leaving, and I saw this ghostly figure And I told my dad, stop, stop, stop. So he stops the car. I got out of the car, and there's this old man sitting on top of a sugar truck that he used to drive. And I approached him and I said, pardon me, how long have you owned this sugar cart? And he goes, oh, since the 1950s. To which my response is, did you ever have a group of kids running behind you every weekend yelling at you until you threw down sugar stalks for them to eat? And he goes, were you one of those obnoxious kids? Guilty as charged. And I took a picture of him because who would say that 56 years had passed and this guy was still there? There's no sugar crop, but he still has his sugar cart that he uses as a taxi. He taxis people from Hershey to Santa Cruz del Norte and other towns nearby, just to help out. Now, the funny thing that I eventually asked him was, why do you have two cows tied to the back of your sugar cart? He had an ox in the front and two cows tied to the back of his cart. And he looked at me and he began laughing. And he goes, I can tell you're not from here. And I said, well, why would you say that? He goes, if I were to leave these cows, even if I tied them, by the time that I came back, there'll be no cows left. Somebody would eat them, and I use them for milk. I don't use them for milk. So these are the cows with the best cardiovascular system you're ever going to find. And then he said something that I'll never forget. It's part of those things that you hear when you go back to 1959. And he said, you know, I miss those sweet days of sugar. Was what he said. I miss those sweet days of sugar, and I even miss you obnoxious kids.
I have difficulty seeing, so let me see. I'm curious. I will say my name in a moment. I'm curious, what is this Jersey or Hersey? What province?
Well, that in just short for Matanzas is still in
Matanzas.
It's still in Havana province, really just very close to the Matanzas border.
Thank you. My name is Maria Huff Edwards, actually Maria Elena Huff, and my mother's name is Prado. My married name is Edwards, but I was born in Cuba. My father's family, my grandparents were actually German descent from Minnesota. And when they got married, they bought land in Cuba in the province of Las Villas, near the town of Manacas, which is in the center. And they actually grew an orange grove, and they were very successful. And of course, my father had this German blood in him that made him a great farmer. But he died very young in 1954, colon cancer. And then, of course, Castro came. And on April 17, 1961, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Cubans really wanted to redeem or bring back all the prisoners from the Bay of Pigs. And what happens was President Kennedy asked the lawyer Donovan, who had just gotten back Gary Powers from the Soviet Union, to broker that with Castro. And on December 1962, the Bay of Pigs prisoners, except for 10 of them, they all came back to the United States. And the very first ship of about 9 ships were exchanged for foods and medicines for the Cuban people. That very first ship, I believe, was around December 24th, 1962. I don't think there was another ship until February the 13th. And on that ship, my mother, my brother, and I came to the United States. There were 673 passengers or refugees. It was set up by the Red Cross, and it was the Santo Cerro, which is it was one of the ships that the Chiquita Banana, you know that what is the name of the company? The American company. Anyway, it was lent for this event. And what used to happen is every time one of these ships went to Havana Harbor to deliver the medicines and the foods, Cubans would know about it. And everybody would try to get out. And we did not live in Havana, but we heard about it. Anyways, the story is we came from Santa Clara overnight. It was a very rushed kind of thing. My mother had to give the Cuban government, she had to sign to give up her bank accounts and our farm and everything in exchange to be able to leave that afternoon, that evening. So we left on the 13th and we arrived in the United States of America on February 14th, 1963. And I remember one of the ladies, we were all under the men were all on top of the ship, you know, around, but most of the women and the children went under where the bananas were kept. There were no bananas except, you know, us. Anyway, I remember waking up and this woman, and there were many cots next to each other. And I remember this woman telling her husband, waking up, and says, oh, Feliz Días de los Enamorados, or something like that. Happy Valentine's Day. We are in America. You know, anyway, so that's, in other words, I am not a Pedro Pan. We were after the Pedro Pan, and it was because of Kennedy that happened. It was in 63. He died in November. And I think the last ship to make that exchange was under the Lyndon Johnson, probably in 65. So, and I am a Cuban. I don't look like a Cuban, but I am a Cuban.
Thank you for your story. Thank you for sharing your story. Let me just mention two things that your story brought to mind. One, in the research that I did, one of the things that I learned was in the early part of the 20th century, there were more than 100 American settlements in Cuba with Americans moving there in order to grow various types of agricultural products like oranges. So this was not a one-off that she was telling you about. There were a lot of American expatriate communities on the island in the early part of the 20th century with people trying to make a living for themselves. The other thing that your story brings to mind is the accounts that I have read about people like you and your family who got out on those ships after the food and drugs were delivered to Cuba as ransom for the brigadistas who had been captured at the Bay of Pigs. And all I can say is, I wish I'd met you when I was doing the reporting on my book, because I'd love to have your story in it. Thank you for sharing it. Have to do a sequel, I guess. Well, my publisher's here, so I'll have to talk to her about that. Thank you.
Hi, if you'll indulge me, a question for each of you. First, Mario, and we'll buy the book afterwards, but I'm impatient. How was your family able to leave?
Ours was a very traumatic leaving. My father was an accountant, and his clients were all American. Frigidaire Corporation, General Electric. It's okay. Frigidaire, General Electric, Sylvania, Emerson, all these American corporations. My father was the accountant. So he had in his ledgers the data of every property that they own, not just the fabrics and the storage and offices, but also the homes of where these expatriates that you talked about lived. In 1960, I remember a conversation with my family back then where somebody brought up the fact, why is Che Guevara being named the president of the Cuban bank? The man has no experience in banking. He's got no experience in accounting, and yet he's the president of the Cuban bank. I remember that conversation. Of course, that's about all that I remember. But the truth became evident one day when two militiamen busted into my father's business, yelling obscenities and demanding the ledgers for his American clients' properties. My father said, no, you can't come here and demand that you come back with a court order. Maybe I'll give it to you, but you just can't do that. He was detained. While he was detained for 3 days, he eventually was taken to Che Guevara, who tried to convince him to be a brother to the revolution and all this stuff. And my dad still said no. Well, you didn't say no to Che Guevara. And he was a criminal. He wasn't the idealistic ideologue that we seem to want to make him these days. He got up, took a gun out, and said, well, this gun says that you will. The men that brought my father from where he was being held to talk to Guevara knew him. When they were kids in Belén, which is a Catholic school, there were two Catholic kids that grew up together and ended up on different sides of the revolution. And he told my father, let's go get your books. If you don't, they're going to kill you. And then they're going to kill him because I'm protecting you. Please, Ignacio, for the love of God, give these people the books. So my father went back, got the books, came back and gave it to Guevara himself. To which Guevara said, Ignacio, if I were you, I would leave the country because I cannot guarantee your future safety here. That was in the summer of 1960. By November of 1960, we boarded a Pan American flight and we came to Miami. It was a traumatic exit, but at least we were able to do it in a plane, an airplane, with other Cubans who, like us, realized that their future safety was no longer in the island.
And this one is for David. In the course of your interviews with people, did they ever get into a discussion of being political refugees versus the economic refugees that we were experiencing now?
There were a few who wanted to draw that distinction between their circumstances and what they perceive the circumstances to be of people who are coming to our borders today, our southwest land border. The more interesting nomenclature issue to me, and one that I struggled with for quite some time, was that some of them call themselves refugees. Some of them call themselves exiles. And those are two very different things. I mean, I actually researched the etymology of both words. I mean, they're very different concepts, and I had a real hard time trying to reconcile the two. A refugee is someone who chooses to leave a place because they believe they are under threat. An exile is someone who is ejected from a jurisdiction by the authorities and is told not to come back. And I had a hard time reconciling the two, but ultimately someone who's a scholar in the area talked it through with me. And what I came to understand was they were refugees when they left, but when they got here, the Cuban government wouldn't let them go back. So they were, in effect, exiles once they got here. That was the real nomenclature issue that I encountered. And once I kind of worked my way through that, it kind of helped me understand much better what they experienced.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question if anybody has one. And then we have both of the authors have books available in the back of the room, and we will have a table set up here at the front where you can get your book signed.
Thank you. William Rodriguez Cairo. Both my parents were Cuban, first generation born here in the U.S. My question is for Mario. What were the biggest challenges your parents faced in creating their new identity when they came to this country?
It really wasn't all that difficult for us because my father had all those American clients for over a decade, and he would come here often. He would come to not just Miami, but other places as well, like New Orleans. That's where they were sending all the equipment, all the not the equipment, the appliances to Cuba. And he would come check on their serial numbers, make sure that they all arrived, that kind of thing. And whenever the CEOs or the other accountants that worked here would go to Cuba, they would always come to our house. I grew up in a home where Americans were in and out, on a monthly basis. In the book, I say it was easy for me to become an American. I understood the culture. And besides, America was the land of baseball, right? And here they played the major leagues. It was the land of Rin Tin Tin, right? I used to watch Rin Tin Tin in Cuba, and here I continue to watch it. Hey, Mighty Mouse. I loved Mighty Mouse. And here they continue to show Mighty Mouse. For me, it wasn't that difficult to become an American, and neither for them. We had an idea of what being an American was. The most difficult thing was learning the culture, the mores, and I think for both my dad and I, the slang. I'll tell you a really funny story of learning slang by fire. And that's in the second book that I'm writing now. It was in the 5th grade. I spoke enough English to get by. And this boy him and I were great buddies, right? Comes to me and he goes, Mario, your nose is running. I had a cold. And I said to him, my nose no run. My foot run. And he goes, no, your foot smell, your nose is running. So I pushed him. I thought he was making fun of me, so I pushed him. And so one of the teachers came and, hey, come on, guys, cut it. Now, we're a good buddy. So I ended up in the principal's office. The assistant principal, her daughter was in my class. I just came from their house in Black Mountain, North Carolina, a month ago. I spent some time there. And she came to my aid. No, these boys are good friends. And they brought the only person in school that spoke Spanish, an Irishman named Stuart Arahan. And so he asked me what happened. I told him he was making fun of me. And then he began laughing. And he told the principal, the assistant principal, what we have here is a gross miscommunication. And like it was back in 1960, the principal goes, okay, my assistant principal says that you two boys are good friends. He says it's a miscommunication. Just hug it out. And we hugged it out, and that was the end of that. But that day I learned I need to understand the slang. This can get me into some trouble someday. And if you really want to know the fear, imagine I came here in November 13, 1960. The first day, I wanted to go and discover America all at once. So I went for a walk around the neighborhood, and in front of so many homes, they had witches, they have people with their heads torn open. They had skulls. It was skeletons. And I went back and I told my dad, what kind of a country is this? Is this Santeria? And he goes, no, Mario. This is Halloween. They just finished it. These people have not brought in their decorations yet. But next year, you can ask for candy. Now, that was unfair. I mean, now that I know what Halloween is, I gotta wait a year to get candy. So yeah, the mores, the culture, that was the most difficult thing to learn. So you can then become an American. It's not just a language. It's not just the values, because the Cuban values align pretty much with American values, is that European values, right? But the difference is the culture.
May I grab the next microphone? I dare not grab the microphone away from Mario. I think I could listen to him forever. Please give them a big hand and buy the book. And I was really thrilled, Maria, to see you come and tell your story. She was a supporter when I mistakenly ran for office. The next thing we have going is the stories of immigration, sharing, learning, and supporting our immigrant neighbors. It's very complimentary to this program on Saturday, October 14th at 4 p.m. Please come back and join the museum. Thank you all.